Welcome to Out and Back, everyone. And I have a special guest today, Woody Matthews. And Woody is a longtime trucking executive with some great knowledge about the trucking industry and the supply chain. And Woody, welcome to Out and Back.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you for having me.
The first question that I have is this New York Times article that was a front page article last week talking about the trucking industry and how it was a problem in the supply chain. And they kind of led off that article with that 80,000, we're 80,000 truck drivers short in the supply chain. And in a previous conversation that you and I had, you said, well, that has to be put into context because of the number of truck drivers that are actually working in the supply chain now. Can you address that?
Sure. Well, to start with, there are about 3.6 million truck drivers that are employed in the United States at the present time. That's up two or 300,000 over the last few years. Those drivers are split into what are characterized as local drivers and long haul drivers. So local drivers would be someone who goes out and back or within a city area, a metro area, whereas a long haul driver drives long distances, typically at least 500 miles or so or greater. Most of the shortage of truckers is in the long haul sector.
And also the New York Times reported that the wages, it's tough work. The wages are low and they're having trouble getting those long haul drivers. Can you provide some context to that?
Yes, there are a high percentage of the trucking industry drivers for smaller carriers are either independent owner operators or they employ 1 to 5 people. Those drivers, by and large, have been comparatively paid less than the major companies. I wouldn't say that if you look at any of the major carriers or the major private fleet operators, that their wages are under market. Walmart, for example, advertises that their full-time drivers make about $86,000 per year. I don't think most people would characterize that as low pay in today's environment. But the starting rate of pay for most industries is probably in the mid 40s.
Okay, and then if it's mid 40s, and I also understand that the trucking industry union also provides a lot of data, and that data is typically pretty good about the number of truck drivers, the wages, the benefits, those kind of things. What is that union, and is it true that the data that they provide is pretty good?
Well, I would say that the best provider of data is not the union, it's the American Trucking Association.
Mm.
They maintain a staff of economists over there, headed up by a guy by the name of Bob Costello, that provides lots of information. They gather that information for their members. All of the major carriers and private fleet operators are members of the American Trucking Association. All of the state associations, which every state has, are also members of the association, and each of those state associations has their own list of members. So the ATA aggregates that data up from the ground level, so to speak, and provides information nationwide about truck transportation, tonnage, drivers, the shortages thereof, and so forth. And that's very reliable. In fact, the federal government relies on the ATA to provide them with information.
Let's talk about the ports, because this is very interesting, because they talk about Los Angeles and Long Beach. And it seems like that is where a lot of the congestion is. However, you had talked about that there are about 50 ports in the United States. That is just 2 of them, but those are 2 of the biggest ports. And is that where a lot of the congestion is and a lot of the problems are?
Yeah, actually, there are more ports than 50. There are about 150 deep water ports around the whole U.S., but they're not all involved with containers. The container traffic, um, containers meaning metal boxes that are, they look like trucks or truck van bodies, except that they're loose. They're not attached to a chassis on a permanent basis, so they can be moved intermodally via ship or rail or truck chassis and so forth. The ports that specialize in that are called container ports, and there are about 25 or 28 of those around the United States, and of those there are 10, the top 10, so to speak, handle about 81 or 82% of the total container volume in and out of the United States. And the port, they're aggregated according to size, and the measurement is something called a TEU, which is a 20-foot equivalent of containers. They're all translated into that data for common comparison. The largest port in the country is the Port of Los Angeles. The second largest is the Port of Long Beach. Those ports are adjacent to one another. For practical purposes and evaluations of their tonnage and activity, you can think of them as one port, or at least I do. And then after them, the Port of New York, New Jersey is the third largest, and then the Port of Savannah, Georgia is one after that. Those four ports comprise about 55% or so of the container traffic in and out of the United States. And there are about 55 to 58 million containers handled annually, totally in the United States. The Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach combined, or the San Pedro ports, are handling about pretty close to 20 million containers. So they're a significant portion of that 31 or 32% of the total. And they're a higher percentage of the top 10, close to 40% of the top 10. So those four key ports where congestion is really important, there's Long Beach, Los Angeles, New York, New Jersey, and Savannah, Georgia.
Well, and that's interesting. So we've heard in the media that the tankers are sitting off, let's call it the Long Beach and Los Angeles ports, and they're just sitting there. But the federal government has now basically said, or everybody understands that it's a problem, okay? And now you've got the tankers, okay, perhaps the tankers are coming in now and the containers are being offloaded. And if they're being offloaded and now there's a trucking shortage or there's a perceived trucking shortage, you have the tankers, you have the port, and then you have it getting into the trucks or the trains. Where do you think the bottleneck is?
Well, that's a pretty deep topic, but the Cliff Notes version of it is that wherever there's an opportunity for a bottleneck to occur, ultimately it will. Those bottlenecks are typically sensitive of, sorry about that, are sensitive to volume, seasonal fluctuations. The whole supply chain network itself is subject to bottlenecks, and not just this most recent time. There have been bottlenecks in the past, but the current era seems pretty unique. I would say in general, the bottlenecks occur because of COVID. That started a year and a half plus ago. It's created a significant reduction of activity and then a significant increase of activity as people thought the disease was abating. And then you have a movement underfoot from a lot of purchasers to buy a lot of products. So you have surges of activity they're going through. Just for fun, before we talked this morning, I logged on to the websites of the Port of Long Beach, Los Angeles, New York, New Jersey, and Savannah to see how they're standing this morning. The Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles combined have 84 container ships at anchor in San Pedro Bay or adrift. They have, between the two of them, about 30 ships at berth being unloaded. They're averaging between those two ports about between 9 and 11 days that a container, once it's unloaded, sits in the port if it's going to what they refer to as local delivery. That's where a single drayage driver can drive out and back within a day's shift. Um, then it's a little less than that, about 3.5, 4 days for rail movement. That's the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. They've got another 30 some ships en route to them. So the problem is going to get better, but not right away. The Port of New York, New Jersey, in contrast, has only 2 ships at anchor. They've got similar statistics, only better than the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles in terms of performance. And then the Port of Savannah has actually quite a number of ships at anchor for them. They've got, I think, 24 this morning. And let's see, they've got 7 ships working at their berths and 24 at anchor waiting to unload. So there continues to be a congestion problem. The cause of that congestion is multiple causes at origin. One, they've just got a lot of containers. They're sitting there for quite a period of time because they've got a big surge. Secondly, they have a shortage of chassis. That's the frame on wheels that the containers are placed on for truckers to move them. The port of, they also move lots of containers out of those ports by rail to points in the center of the country and elsewhere, where they're then offloaded again at the destination and put on a chassis and pulled by truck to final delivery. The delay problems in the local markets are they're out of warehouse space in many of these locations. So the truckers bring a container in, the warehouse barely has room for it. They end up dropping in the yard. They've got no empty chassis or containers to pull back. So the truckers can't get the equipment out and back because it's sitting on average out in those local markets 9 or 10 days before the container is unloaded. That's because of a combination of congestion at these suppliers' markets and just simply lack of warehouse space.
So let's talk about the containers, because I've been talking with CEOs and their container costs have gone from about $5,000 to somewhere in the area of $30,000 to $35,000. And those containers, you know, they're from China or Southeast Asia or whatever, and they come, and then that they pay $30,000 per container, and then the container sits there, and then on a tanker, and then it sits there in the port, and then it goes someplace. Let's say it goes to Salt Lake City or to Phoenix, and it goes there, and then because of the congestion, does that container just stay there? Because when that circulation is healthy, it would seem like that container would immediately get loaded and go back to Long Beach to then go to China, whether that be meat or corn or whatever that would be.
Well, ideally, every time a transport operator or trucker brings a container on a chassis into a facility and leaves it, he would pull an empty one out back out. But that requires, first of all, for an empty one to be available and the chassis to pull it with. And there's less of an impetus or an urgency, sense of urgency to get empty containers back than there are full ones. Currently, there's a significant imbalance, particularly in the West Coast ports, on outbound export traffic versus inbound traffic. So there are far fewer containers loaded going out than there are coming in. So the sense of the people who are responsible for those as well as just an empty container. But unfortunately, the problem is those manufacturing facilities in the Far East, China, Vietnam, and so forth, cannot load a container unless they have it back. The ships, when they're unloaded, need to be reloaded with both full and empty, full containers for export and empty ones if they don't have those. Currently, the Los Angeles Long Beach balance is they've got about 70% empties for every assortment of containers they put on ships going back out, high percentage of empties. So they need to get those back and get them, get them back on the ships. The problem is that the ports don't have enough space because of container congestion to bring all those empties back and stage them.
So is a lot of this, again, this is one of those sweeping questions that doesn't have a simple answer, but you're good at ciphering this and getting it down to a simple answer. So I was reading yesterday that one of the authors was saying that consumers are spending like drunken sailors right now because they're so excited about getting their families back for Christmas, and everybody's going to get everything they want. And is that one of the problems? Is we have so much being imported into these ports because of the huge increase in consumer demand post-pandemic?
Well, if you look at the statistics, just look at the flow of activity by container movement for the year 2019, using that as kind of a base year of activity. 2020, when the COVID pandemic started, for the first half of the year, the container traffic was significantly reduced. It was down in the 8% range, or reduced by about 8% range, varying, of course, by port. The last half of 2020, when things reopened, that business surged back up, so that for the full year of 2020 compared to 2019, they were only marginally down, just down a percentage point or two. So then you look at the first half of 2021 and the last 3 months of the quarter for the third quarter of 2021, and traffic has gone up significantly. If you compare the first 9 months of 2021 against the first 9 months of 2020, okay, they're up double digits in every port, with the exception of the Port of Oakland, which is up only about 4%. The rest of them were up anywhere between 12 and 26% in terms of just volume. Now, if you compare that back to 2019, for the first 9 months of 2019, the percentage increases are significantly less. 2020 was an abnormal year if you're comparing just that first 9 month interval. So it's hard to say whether this surge we're having right now is due to just people spending like drunken sailors, to use your term. That may be an insult to drunken sailors.
It's true.
The balance of the problem really is just seasonal fluctuation. It's holiday season. The retailers buy a bunch of stuff around the world for a holiday season, so there's that natural increase in activity that's causing this in part of this recovery, but the rest of it is seasonal fluctuation.
So if you're a brand or a company and you've got this problem and you've spent a lot more money in the supply chain to get the goods and services to your brick and mortars and to your e-commerce partners, if you what's the solution for them? They're spending more time, they're spending more money on the containers, their supply chain costs have certainly gone up.
Sure.
Is there a solution for them? I know that Walmart has got their own tankers now, and I mean, is that correct? And I mean, is that part of the solution now? Some of these big companies just take the supply chain over to a certain extent?
Well, the steamships that still called steamships, even though they don't move by steam anymore, that move containers are called container ships. I don't believe that any of the major retailers own any of the container ships. They own containers. That's a strategy that may be employed by some major retailers in order to ensure that they have an adequate supply. But as far as the pricing is concerned, this huge gain from $2,500 a container to $25,000 a container for movement, those rates are determined by the steamship company and their alliances. They're the ones who determine those rates. So now inclusive in those rates are things like customs duties fees and loading and unloading fees and so forth. But the big pressure is just the inability to get their ships unloaded in a timely fashion. And this is not just a U.S. domestic problem. problem is existing internationally. If you can do your own search on the internet and find out that the port of Felixstowe, for example, in England is way congested. You've got driver shortages all over Europe and in the UK, for example, claims that they have more than 100,000 drivers short. Um, some of those problems are more societal problems where people don't want to be a driver. They perceive that as being less attractive as a career opportunity than being, I guess, a computer coder. You are to be a driver. You're particularly a long haul driver. You're going to be out away from home for prolonged periods of time. So, but to get back to the point about containers and rates, individual retailers and individual companies can own their own containers. That's possible. Is it prudent for them to do so? That depends. Sometimes they have a difficult time getting those containers back, even when they own them. The steamship companies own most of the containers. The vast majority are owned by them, and they're responsible in most pricing arrangements. They're responsible for getting the pricing arrangements between the shipper and the consignee using a steamship company for the transportation, or some third party acting on behalf of all parties. They are they're going to move that product through from door to door. So the responsibility of getting those containers back and out really becomes the responsibility of the steamship company working through their various service providers. Go ahead. I'm just going to say finally, supply chain management is the word or the phrase used to manage all these choke points and resource availability problems. I believe that this problem will ameliorate substantially after this holiday season. Will it go away permanently? It will not. You have many of these ports just need to increase capacity. A question, for example, is why is the New York, New Jersey port not congested, but the Port of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles are? Is it because they have more land available? Do they have more land to store containers? Do they have more efficient truckers? Are they making more efficient use of inland staging facilities called inland ports? What are they doing that's so different? Why are Savannah and Long Beach and Los Angeles having such problems?
So let's go back to the long haul truckers at this point. 80,000, if it's true, if 80,000, there are 80,000 long haul truckers or truckers short, most of them being long haul. And you have 3.6 million truckers in the United States. That doesn't seem like it should be a pressure point, but it seems like it is.
Well, it is a pressure point for a long haul. As you and I spoke before, Paul, that represents slightly more than 2% of the trucker base. In most enterprises, if you have a 2% shortfall of employees, you can flex the hours of the other employees to encompass the needs and produce what you need to produce. And the trucking industry has been doing that for a long time. The shortage problem is getting slightly worse, and there's some practical reasons for it. You get electronic logs, so you can't cheat in your driving hours anymore. So they're for the long haul drivers. When there is a shortage, you tend to use your existing people. You ride your existing horses longer and put them away wet. So you have a lot of issues relating to utilization of that particular class of drivers. One of the things that may be improved by that is better recruitment practices or strategies to focus more on younger people, showing them the advantages of it, focus more on females as drivers. They make very good long haul drivers, and they represent about 8 or 9% of the long haul driving force now. So there are some strategies to be employed, but COVID has been an impact on the availability of new drivers because the driving training schools have had to shut down. Many of the Department of Motor Vehicles that test drivers have been closed. It's just been more difficult to get drivers on staff.
Oh, I'll leave you with this question. It's not an easy one, but let's go into the future. Let's talk about high-speed trains. Let's talk about self-driving trucks. Let's talk about, Are all these things being considered as eventually as a part of the solution, automating ports even more?
Yeah, in fact, there are even more issues than that. Start with just automating ports. All the ports are making some move towards automation. Automation means without people, right? You have a sort of robot unloading and loading. That's impacted by the Longshoremen Union, which doesn't want that to happen. From a driver's perspective, of course, the driving force doesn't want that to happen either, robotic driver movement. But the reality is that you have several companies that are actively working right now to provide robot, I shouldn't say robot, that's a poor term, self-driving heavy duty trucks. The practical problem with that is they really are only at the current time frame in the near future can only be used for long haul trucking. Of course, that's where the most critical shortage is. Can you imagine in a metro area, it's not just getting a truck from point A to B, but when it gets there, when it shows up at a warehouse, if it doesn't have a driver in it, who's going to put it into the door to be unloaded? Who's going to come in and talk to the dispatcher and say, or the supervisor at the warehouse and say, I don't want you to put that in door 9. I'd like it parked out in the back lot. We'll put it in ourselves at some future point. Those sorts of practical problems are mean, in my view, that long haul truck transportation is going to be from big marshaling yards to other big marshaling yards. But that technology is within reach now. They're actively testing that. I would expect in a few years, you're going to see a significant number of particularly long haul carriers employing those methodologies on the streets soon.
So shop early. shop early and often. And basically, I think, Woody, we're coming up with the conclusion that it will solve itself the supply chain will solve itself to a certain degree, to a certain extent. There's always been some choke points in the supply chain. The pandemic has made it worse. But now as we move post-pandemic, hopefully the supply chain and all the various components can adjust. Would that be a reasonable conclusion?
I think that's a fair statement. These ports have some very capable people involved in their operations. All of these drayage companies and transportation companies also have very capable people who are looking for solutions every day to these problems, and they'll find them. I mean, it's part of supply chain management. The people who buy will change their sourcing. If they get burned 3 or 4 times from buying something from China and they have an alternative to buy it from Europe and have it come into the port of New York, New Jersey instead of Long Beach, they may do that. So these problems will work themselves out long term. I think that they'll get much better in the first part of this coming year, just after the seasonal push is over.
Well, let's hope so. Woody Matthews, thank you, trucking executive. This was fascinating on the supply chain, and thank you for being our guest on Out and Back.
Welcome, Paul. I was happy to be here.